Hello and welcome to Boxset, Binge the Bible, the podcast from Seven Vineyards, where we are listening through the entire Bible in a year. My name is Bern and Leckie, joined by Owen Lynch.
Hi there.
Now, some weeks when we've been doing this, it has felt like a nice little gentle stroll through historical stories. A little reminder of Sunday school's past. Some weeks it's felt like a difficult journey, looking at people's suffering and trying to explain really difficult things like that. This week, we've been looking at both the end of John's Gospel and Paul's letter to the Romans. And I think you could probably have taken any chapter of any of these things and done an entire PhD on them. My head is spinning, but in a kind of a good way. What's your experience been, Owen?
Certainly, listening to John has been just brilliant in many ways, to reminding me about the upside down nature of God's kingdom. But the reality is that Romans has taken far longer to digest, and I've got a lot of familiarity with Romans myself, having spent a lot of time thinking about it, because it's largely, I would say, probably my favourite book of the Bible in some ways.
Really? Wow.
I think largely because when I was a student, I got involved with some very conservative evangelical Christians as a student worker with UCCF, the University Scholars Christian Fellowship. And back then, we used to go to conferences and stuff where there'd be lots of pretty full-on Bible teaching. And I always remember Romans being the kind of, some real academic stuff, you know what I mean? And Romans always been central to that. And I gained a real appreciation of Romans back then, and it's never really left me, really.
Interesting. And it's also, I think, a source of evangelism directly, with a thing called the Romans Road to Salvation. Have you heard of this one?
No, that one's passed me by.
The Romans Road to Salvation, I thought you were going to mention. It's essentially a summary, dragging proof texts from Romans to take people on a little journey to say, first of all, you're full of sin. We're all full of sin. Secondly, we need to approach Jesus because he can relieve us of that. And then thirdly, we can look forward to eternal life. The destination that often people seem to have in mind when they're sharing this is, what happens when we die? Do we go to heaven or do we not go to heaven? And have you not ever had people coming up to you on the street asking you about this? Because this is what they want to share. If you show an interest, they'll share this Romans Road to Salvation as your ticket to heaven, your ticket to knowing that you will be with God when you die, and that you won't be condemned to death or eternal punishment or whatever else it is that those people believe in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually was one of those people at one point. When I was a young student in my late teens, early 20s, I was like, super enthusiastic about going on the streets and telling people about Jesus, and telling people that, all their thoughts about Jesus were probably wrong, and we need to set them right on what we think. And we used to do this thing where we'd have a piece of white paper, and we'd use paint to gradually present the gospel in a way that we thought would be helpful to people. And invariably, it wasn't. Not many people really related to it. But that said, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of that was drawn from Romans.
Not many people really respond to this message of, there's this really important thing you need to sort out before you die.
That's right.
Because of how important, because of how long it is, how long eternity is, and how important it is that your destination when you go when you die is. And the really odd thing to me is that we're surprised by this, because this is a thing that the church has been stewing on, it seems like, for the last 1,000 years. It was about the Middle Ages when the church really started stewing on the question of what happens to us when we die. Like, that was really all important. And yet, when you actually go back and listen to John's Gospel, or even Romans, count all the references there are to this heavenly afterlife. Look at all the stress that Jesus put on getting your ticket to heaven. If that was the most important thing, I would just say Jesus must have been a terrible teacher, because he kept getting sidetracked on all these earthly issues, like, how do you live now? How do you treat people now? How do you love people now? Why is it important to treat money well now? Why is it important to treat wealth and possessions and promises and trust and relationships? Why is that a good thing to do now? Why is Jesus focused on all these side issues if the only important thing was getting your ticket to heaven? And the answer's obvious, right? Isn't it? I mean, it's just, Jesus was not a terrible teacher. It's just we're terrible learners. Somehow we've lost track. And so I think maybe the best thing is to ground ourselves again. Let's go back to John's Gospel and remind ourselves, because this is a kind of an interesting sort of heaven meets earth kind of sequence, the end of John's Gospel. But there's lots of earthly things about it as well as some heavenly things. What do you notice? I mean, around the end of John's Gospel, what does it all mean? How does it stand out as meaningful to you?
Well, that's a good question, because I think when we look at these last few chapters of John, and as we've been listening to them, the theme really is Jesus' death and then his resurrection. And I think what John is trying to do, and let's not forget John is as an agenda here, he's trying to help us understand that Jesus is the Messiah. He actually says so in chapter 20 verses 30 to 31. I've written this so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But what we notice here is that a key objection that many Jews had to Jesus being the Messiah was his death. They didn't expect him to die on the cross. And yet what John does is say that actually Jesus' death was a victory. But most of his Jewish companions would have said, well, I don't quite understand what does that look like? Because what is victory, Jesus style? And I think what we see in John here is we see him showing that the Messiah, this King of Israel, will demonstrate his power and his kingdom, not in the way that kings or Caesars demonstrate their power. In fact, in quite the opposite way. The account of the gospel as John portrays it is upside down in terms of what victory looks like. Jesus, first of all, washes his disciples' feet as a servant, as a slave, and he then goes to his death as a servant, as a slave, subjecting himself to the whims of other people, the will of other people. And in this situation, I think what John is showing us here is that Jesus is the Messiah, but the Messiah of as John presents it is not the sort of Messiah that his compatriots were expecting, and that for me really stands out in these last few chapters, just in terms of the manner of his death, the way in which he willingly goes to his death. And I think when we see that use of the word "I am," because when he's arrested, the soldiers come and they say, "Who's Jesus?" and he says, "I am," and "I am he," Jesus said, and
then they fall over.
Yeah,
did you notice that?
Yeah, they fall over. John says, "Why?" Why? Because that's the term that is used of God himself in the Hebrew Bible. So there's this kind of like, whoa, this I am moment, and everyone's stunned. I don't think it's just because he said I am. I think it was a sort of like a realization, if you like. Oh my life, this person is powerful. But the power is demonstrated in weakness. And that's the upside down nature of the kingdom. And I do wonder sometimes whether Christians have really lost that perspective, and that actually Jesus is, as he said himself, my power is made perfect in my weakness, and that really is profound, and I think it goes against everything that we instinctively think, and that's why we find it difficult to accept.
So weakness and brokenness, that's a profoundly earthly concept though, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think the difficulty is, and the difficulty that the church can find and has found through history, is it's found itself on earth desperately trying to get off, desperately trying to build something else, or ascend, or escape, or get to heaven, as if that's our mission. To kind of, we use earth as a launch pad and aim for the heavens. Whereas I think what Jesus is demonstrating, what you see in his life and then in his submission to death on the cross, is that he is accepting of other people's brokenness It's other people's brokenness that's led him to that death sentence, not his own. He didn't deserve it. But by accepting that, he can then also accept and demonstrate the full power of heaven and what heaven wants to do with its power, which is to renew the earth. And that changes the direction of flow, I think. That's the upside downness. You were saying about upside downness of Jesus in the kingdom. Yeah, I really feel that because we then have to, that turns my expectation upside down. That instead of God requiring us to be good and work our way up to heaven, God wants us instead to be accepting of his love for us so that it can pour down from heaven. And what's it pouring down from heaven for? For the renewal of us, for the renewal of our relationships, for the renewal of our society, for the renewal of the earth. And that's, I think, reconciling how Jesus is spending his entire ministry teaching about the earth and things we do on earth, not how to earn or somehow show up with the right state of mind to get given a free ticket to heaven.
That's right. And Jesus, when he's asked by Pilate, John says, he tells him that his kingdom is not of this world. In other words, meaning that he is a king and that his kingdom is for this world, but it's radically different. It's radically different from the system of power that is exhibited in the Roman Empire under Caesar and indeed under Pilate, who was Caesar's representative in that region of the Roman Empire. And Jesus is at a point to say that this is a different kingdom to the kingdom that you're used to. It's a different value system, radically different value system, and a radically different power system as well. And
it has every interest in transforming the earth. That's why I guess Caesar was right to be worried about it, because how many kings can you have? How many kings can you have ruling? How many ruling powers can you have in a region? Well, the Romans were pretty clear, one, it's us. They'd let people get on and worship their local gods and follow their local customs and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately everything had to be paid. Due had to be paid. Taxes had to be paid to the Romans, and Roman law had to be applied to everybody, which included their ability to grab people to carry their stuff and do their work for them and that sort of thing if they weren't Roman citizens. People could be made slaves. People could be the Roman economy wouldn't have worked at all without slavery, and so you have this whole empire built on the exploitation of humanity, the imposition of power by a few, exploiting the muscles and willingness of many to work and not starve, basically, in order to keep themselves alive, to keep their families alive, and then keep the whole empire moving. Essentially, that's what it was all based on. And I think people had this sense of, well, I guess this is how it works, but we can imagine a better way of life, can't we? Especially if you're a slave, you can imagine a better way of life. You can imagine something much better happening, and so I think it's interesting that this happened here and then, where it's not just a deliverance of hope for the Jews who've been looking for a Messiah, but it's speaking into a culture that needed hope and rescuing from itself, and from its own inherent injustices. And I suspect that the Romans, that the people that Paul was writing his big letter to, were profoundly aware of that, weren't they? And I guess they were all sort of very much wondering about Jesus and what role Jesus could have. Also, maybe wondering, who was Jesus after he rose from the dead? You noticed something weird about that, didn't you?
Right. I mean, the interesting thing about what John describes, he actually describes Jesus appearing to his disciples 3 times. But in all 3 occasions, they're kind of like strange occurrences. Like Jesus just appearing in a locked room with them. Jesus just appearing on the side of the seashore and telling them to throw the nets over the other side of the boat. You know, the word apparition does not communicate very well in English what's going on here. But when you look at the definition of apparition, it would be an unusual occurrence, unexpected occurrence, and I think that's why the word apparition does actually work here. Where there's this apparition of Jesus, it's not quite normal. It's not quite as you would expect. There's something not quite normal about it.
They don't recognize Jesus at first,
right?
Or when they do recognize him, he's something different about him, some sort of kind of aura or a different sort of appearance.
Exactly, some sort of mysticalness about him. And I think even, I think evangelical Christians, particularly, if I may get back to that group of people of which, I've had a long tradition to be part of, struggle with even any sense of mysticism with regards to the appearance of Jesus in our day-to-day lives now. And yet, that's exactly what happened to the disciples post-resurrection. And what's more, even in the book of Acts, the start of Acts, where we see Jesus ascend into heaven, like that's a very mysterious, mystical kind of experience that those guys had. And indeed, so was the experience of Pentecost for them. So, and there's on and on and on. We kind of have these experiences of Jesus which go beyond our kind of our senses and perhaps our expectation of what is normal, and yet we read about this in John's Gospel, we read about it in Acts, we even read about it in Paul's letters, and yet perhaps evangelical Christians have kind of struggled to kind of embrace that a little bit. Maybe it's part of the scientific enlightenment, and there was a lack of credibility in kind of claiming those things about Jesus. But nevertheless, there's this sense, I think, for me that actually nowadays people are like, they're looking for that unusual, that unexpected, that mystical experience, because it is part of the human experience. And if we deny that, then we kind of miss something of our relationship with Jesus, right?
Absolutely. Now, when we say mystical, sometimes I think we mean like we want it to be mysterious. We want to just put it into a mystery box and not ask questions about it. I don't really like that way of life. I like approaching mysteries and trying to see how do they look from different angles? Can we make any sense of them? Is there any physical sense we can make out of these descriptions of Jesus? I strongly suspect that at some point in the future, we will. At some point in the future, our knowledge of physics will expand. And we'll be able to make more sense of what currently looks to us like something unexplainable within our conception of physical reality. But my strong suspicion is that God just exists in other dimensions of of reality that we just don't access. That sounds like a huge oversimplification. But do we not have this sense that there is something more than what we can explain? Yeah, I was actually watching a conversation between physicists yesterday, trying to explain to themselves or each other, or come up with some mechanism. Is there any mechanism they thought we could use to explain free will? And they realised that they couldn't explain free will with physical law, because if everything is physically within the dimensions which we can measure and predict and experiment. If everything exists within that and obeys deterministic laws, there's no possible mechanism that they could think of that says, okay, but then this particle or this object or this collection of particles or this collection of objects, this person, this being, can choose to go one way or the other. Everything is determined by previous states and what they're moving in. Now there's uncertainty. There's always uncertainty about where something is or what something's going, and you could rely on that to give you a bit of a fuzz factor. But that doesn't explain agency. That doesn't explain how you can make a choice in the world. And I think that's fascinating to realise, because I think they're right, that within the physical parameters we have, we can't explain that. And yet we feel we must, because we feel that we must have responsibility for our actions. If you were to go into court and say, I'm sorry, I'm a deterministic mechanism, and whatever I did, I didn't have any choice over, that would be the excuse to get out of everything. We wouldn't be able to have laws. We wouldn't be able to apply them to ourselves. We wouldn't be able to feel that we can have expectations that I will do something because it's a good choice to make. You wouldn't be able to reward someone for their wisdom of making good choices, or pull up where you think a choice was not so good. What would you be criticising? You'd be criticising physics. You wouldn't be there wouldn't be anything else meaningful to criticise, right? If we don't have free will and we can't make choices and we don't have responsibility. And so we're in this weird position, I think, where yes, we want to believe that everything can be explainable through physical law. I believe it is. I think there's just dimensions that we haven't accessed yet. There's aspects to consciousness probably that we just don't know how they work, and God does, but we don't yet, and we may find out maybe in our lifetimes, or maybe later on we might find out more about this. But if we're going to maintain that we have responsibility and we can make choices, we're already breaking with we're already into the mystical, if you like, even though we don't like to call it that. Does that make sense?
Well, you've probably just blown all our minds with that Bern, but we appreciate what you're saying. Sure, we can sift something really profound from what you've said, because obviously it was very profound. And the reality is that the position we find ourselves in with the gospel of Jesus is actually dealing with a person, right? We're dealing with a person called Jesus who sacrificed his own life for the sake of his friends. He placed himself, if you remember the back end of John, he went to Jerusalem to raise Lazarus from the dead, but he knew he was going to therefore put himself in harm's way. And he sacrificed himself for his friends, and he said, greater love of no man than he sacrificed his life for his friends. So we're dealing with a person called Jesus who expresses unconditional love, and this I guess this is why Paul was so passionate about this gospel, right? I mean, this is why he writes to the Romans. How did you find Romans how did it impact you? What were your thoughts on the way in which Paul approaches Romans and why he wrote that letter?
Well, I think there's a huge connection here between the mystical idea of, like, do we have any free choice? Do we have any responsibility? Where does that come from? And the whole subject of Romans, because Romans is about what we do with responsibility. Paul, in writing to the Romans, assumes that we can make choices, that we hold each other accountable for our choices, and that we want the world to be better than it is now. One of the odd things, I think, like really a shocking thing, actually, considering who he's writing to, the society that he's writing to, where slavery is a hot topic, and loads of people want to be free from slavery. They want to be able to have freedom. They want to be able to make their own choices. But Paul introduces himself as a slave. Now, it doesn't say slave in my Bible. It says servant, because we've watered it down. But he uses the word that means slave, as a slave of Christ. That's how he introduces himself. I was reading a book this week about called Romans Disarmed. It was a fascinating book that tries to imagine how this letter would have sounded to first century believers in that society. And their first reaction, hearing Paul's first words, is shock and indignation. Who's this guy think he is? Why is he trivializing slavery? He's not. We know he's not a slave. Why is he talking as if he is a slave? And he's always lost people at the intro. So why does he do that? I think it's a really interesting question. And so Paul's telling a grand story of, in one sense, slavery that we're all part of. He also tells a story about a brokenness, a broken state that we're all part of, a broken society for sure, a broken society that people would usually blame on other people, the same way you and I would if we were accused, if we were approached by a street preacher to think about our sin or whatever. Would we admit that we're sinners? This is the street preachy kind of patter. Like, well, but I'm not as bad as these other people. And I would immediately jump to think of other people that are worse than me. Paul does that in the first chapter of Romans, he starts this description of these terrible other people who are causing all this suffering and horribleness in the world, and then artfully folds in himself, essentially, and us, all of us, implicates all of us in this stuff that is causing brokenness. I think it's worth unpacking this word that he uses that we call sin, because sin's such a churchy word, right? So do you know the word hamartia? Do you know what it literally means? The word that he uses in Greek.
Yeah, it's a fatal flaw, isn't it? In a Greek tragedy, it's a fatal flaw that leads someone to do something that no one else would do, but because they've got that fatal flaw, they tend to do it and they mess everything up for themselves, right?
It literally means missing the mark, and yes, it's often used in the sense of a fatal flaw or a character flaw. It's also used in the sense of just brokenness, and if something is meant to work a certain way and it's not working the way it ought to work, then you can say it's missing the mark. It's broken. It's not doing the thing that it ought to do. One of the things I think when we use the word sin just instead of that, I think it's too easy for Christians to then kind of get ourselves bogged down in discussions about laws and rules and religiosity and the sort of thing. As I was a kid, I was a Roman Catholic, and so we'd go to confession every now and again to confess our sins, and we all had to think of something convincing, something we were willing to share that didn't look like we were just trying to sail through, but also, it was a reasonable engagement. I think we also had this experience as well, that it was in some ways quite a liberating experience, quite a nice experience, if we could admit to something that was really weighing us down, something that we were really struggling with, maybe. And if we were prepared to say it out loud to someone in private and have that someone pray for us and accept us and pronounce God's forgiveness for us and share that in a practical way, I found there was actual real benefits to that. But it also felt like going to the dentist and something like I'd want to avoid. And it's not a practice that I think we carry on outside of the Catholic Church. Protestants tend to sort of think that's a bit of religion we could get away from. Thank you very much. In sharing about brokenness, though, and realising my own brokenness, I'm realising I have an unpopular opinion here. I don't think most people warm to the idea that they'd like to characterise themselves as fatally flawed and broken. We'll keep going back to, but I'm fine though, really. And Paul's trying to gently walk us through, sometimes less gently than others, maybe along this story that he's telling, that not only is recognizing brokenness in ourselves and in relationships and society important for us, but how we react to that and where we go for a fix, where we go to get the brokenness mended, is all important. And the only place he's recommending to do this, showing us to do this, is Jesus. And that is the crux of it, I guess. So what do you think? How does that work? Does that sound right to you so far? Have I messed this up, or is it?
Yeah, no. And you certainly couldn't describe as what you said as messed up. No, I think you're right. I think you're tapping in at a very human level to some of what Paul is trying to talk about here. I'm mindful that when we read Paul, I think he uses a lot of language and imagery, metaphorical imagery, to try and make his point, which is really to bring together two groups of people, the Gentiles and the Jews, within the gospel of Jesus. And I think you're absolutely right. He's highlighting the brokenness, because what was happening, I think, in Rome was that the Jews were saying, the Gentiles, they're just, they've got these Roman Gentiles, they've just got some terrible things going on, and we as Jews cannot engage with that. And I like to think of chapters 1 and 2 as a sting operation, where Paul lulls the Jews into this false sense of security, saying, oh yes, the Gentiles are like this, and ever since creation they've been doing this, that, and the other. And I know the Jews are going, yes, Paul, that's right, yes, they're terrible. And then he says, yeah, but you've got no excuse, you've been doing the same thing. And I can hear him kind of trying to win over the Jews to the point of view that you just said there, which is that we're all broken, and we all need that that connection with God, with Yahweh, and that none of us are any different. He's really addressing the kind of, if you like, the hypocrisy of the Jews, and trying to bring them together. And I think that is definitely something that I personally find very helpful as I think about my own life and the worldview that I have. Because some people may kind of obviate their responsibility, right, and say, "Oh, I'm not responsible for that. It's just the way I am. It's just, it's not my fault that this happened to me, and therefore I'm like this." No. Paul would say, no. You're still responsible for what you're responsible for.
Yeah.
And I like that about Paul. I think I like that about the gospel as well. I think it's a bit of a bugbear for me, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Now, where the church has tied itself up in knots over the years has often been on the issue of what was it that Paul was really talking about, and why was he talking about it? If we take the view, as the church started to do kind of in the Middle Ages, that salvation, that the thing that God really wants for us is essentially a ticket to heaven, the escape from the earth and being with him in eternity. And then the important thing was, how do we get that? Do we have to pay for it? Do we have to earn it? Or do we get given it for free because of God's love for us? That's still, weirdly, that still feels like a live question. And the question that street evangelists will kind of pest you about. How do you know what's going to happen when you die? Paul doesn't mention that at all. It's not there. He's talking about something far bigger, which is the restoration of life and a kingdom of God coming into the world, which will overturn injustice. Yeah, that's a much bigger deal. To say that we just get that through our right thinking, our correct religious thinking and belief in Jesus, is ludicrous. Because that gets you. That gets you into the door of meeting Jesus and starting to understand who Jesus is. But what then? And Paul is answering the far bigger question of not how do you guarantee your personal salvation. That's a trivial question compared with how do you change life on earth? How does God change life on earth here and overturn genuine injustice? How does God do what he wants to do, not just to us, but through us, for the world? That's a huge question. And it's a question that Paul, I think, directly answers. One of the steps in that journey is though the simple accepting of what it is that Jesus has done for us. In chapter 3, a much debated phrase is the righteousness, this sort of restored, right, unbroken, good relationship with God, is given through, it says in my Bible, through faith in Christ to all who believe. But then there's a little footnote that says, could also mean through the faithfulness of Christ to all who believe. Well, those two completely different things. You have some thoughts on this, don't you? Because I've heard you speak on this many times.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that it actually underlies a real source of confusion amongst Christians. Is it about me and trying to impress God, or is it that Jesus has been faithful, or is it me that has to be faithful? Which comes first? It's like the chicken and egg. And I think very much the sense of the faithfulness of Jesus puts the onus on Jesus being faithful, and that we live faithful lives with Yahweh, with God, with Jesus, out of his faithfulness, in response to his faithfulness. But of course, often Christians get it the other way around, and they say that we will only be acceptable to God if we are faithful to God. So I think it's a source of confusion and pain for many Christians, and also a reason why people tend to kind of switch off to the gospel of Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely found myself realizing it makes much more sense to think of it as Jesus being faithful. That's not to say we shouldn't be faithful, and being faithful is one of the fruit of the Spirit, as Paul says in Galatians 5. But nevertheless, in terms of justification, we're talking about Jesus' faithfulness as opposed to our own. Is that how you read it?
Yes, and no, not entirely. I don't think it's a matter of either or when it comes to, is it about Jesus' faithfulness to us or our faithfulness in Jesus? And the reason why I think this is because of things that I've fairly recently discovered, and I think some scholars have only fairly recently dug up in their explorations of how life worked in the society that Paul was writing to. Paul was writing to a society where typically people didn't have a lot of resources, but there was no social security system for people who weren't earning. Slavery was a very, very extreme option for people who were out of cash and needed to be able to survive. But a much more common option, in fact, the option that a lot of people really wanted was to be able to practice a skill they were good at and have a sponsor who would sponsor them through life. They would be able to say, I will pay you to do all your bread making. Say, you're a bread maker. Great. I need a bread maker, says the rich sponsor. And the rich sponsor would set you up with all the things that you needed, give you all the equipment you needed, maybe a place to do your business out of, and expect that you'd be able to get on with it and make a profit and enjoy your life and support your family using your skills, using his stuff that he's by grace given you. That's the grace which also shows up in what Paul's writing about here. By grace, it's not a sort of a just being nice. It's a practical provision of stuff that you couldn't afford, but your sponsor can give you. Now, there's a sponsorship. There's patronage really is another word for that. Does that come without strings? No, it doesn't. Not at all. In fact, it comes with a very weighty string of rope, really, which is called relationship. It comes with the expectation of faithfulness in relationship. So when your sponsor, let's say you're a bread maker, your sponsor's throwing a party, and they go, oh, well, great, I better get my bread guy to do some bread for my party. They would call on you and you would be expected to respond, right? If you didn't respond to your sponsor with, yes, okay, let me do that, or at least to explain, the situation, how to get it done, you wouldn't be faithful within that relationship. So what Paul is describing through faithfulness, this pistis relationship, is a relationship where God calls us into a whole life of being provided for, but also being expected to respond, being given all the things that we need, and being expected to make use of them. This, for me, makes sense of Jesus' whole ministry. Why did Jesus concentrate on showing what to do with God's things? Why did Jesus concentrate on showing us how to live good life on earth and what God could expect from us? It's not because he wants us to earn our way into heaven. It's because God wants heaven to resource us to transform the earth. That's the entire point. Now, I think the practicality and why it's still difficult, I think, to engage with Romans. Partly, Romans is a very big, complicated book. It takes us through lots of uncertain territory. It challenges us. It certainly challenges me when I think, I'd like to just have a faith, like a nice simple faith, and believe in God, and then believe everything else just works itself out. But it keeps challenging me. I think what Paul's challenge is as he reflects in himself, although he has this relationship and he's received his relationship with Jesus that Jesus instigated, Paul still struggles with brokenness. Paul still struggles with his own choices, and he recognises that we all do too. And so he also leads us on a journey to discover how to deal with that, how to know what it is that God really wants for us. And for me, I think this is really the heart of my favourite bit of Romans anyway. I think there's like huge amounts of stuff going in the letter, but my attention always keeps coming back when I feel that I need a bit of sort of guidance stroke comfort for what's God really doing with us, what does God really want from me, my attention keeps coming back to chapter 12 in Romans. And that's where I'm reminded that through this relationship and through all this grace that God's given us, he hasn't just given us a few abilities to do some nice things. He's also equipped us to be in his presence like priests. Like he's cleared the way to do things that were previously roped off from us. And he's brought us in to be priests, to do this amazing thing where we can offer ourselves as living sacrifices. That's no small deal. That's Paul saying, you're allowed in to the heart of what God's doing, and you're allowed to bring yourself, and God's willing to accept you. God's willing to accept me as the sacrifice. God doesn't accept broken sacrifices. God doesn't accept rubbish as sacrifices. This was all in the law. You had to bring a really good sacrifice. So when it says in Romans 12, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, he's not saying, bring any old rubbish. He's saying, no, they bring this really good thing. Bring this amazing thing that God's built. Bring yourself, but also be prepared to have your mind changed. And that's the path that God has for us. A life where whatever it is we thought we grasped, whatever it is we thought we've learned from Jesus, yes, we've learned brilliant things. There's always going to be something else to learn. There's always going to be something that we need to maybe offer up as like, well, this is what I thought. Let me just put that down. God, could you give me that back, or give me something better in exchange? And I think God does that. That's the transformation by the renewing of our minds. And to be able to know God's mind and what's on God's mind, isn't that the most amazing thing of all? Out of all of this, and not just so we can be clever and feel good, but so that we can do all those things that God wants to be able to do through us to transform us and our relationships and the world around us. This is how it really comes to reality. And we could go on forever about this book, but we've got more to do next week. What are we going to look at then?
Yeah, we're going to be looking at Lamentations, which is a nice little short section, and then we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel. Have you listened to Daniel? Read much of Daniel recently, Ben?
It's one of my favourite books in the Bible. Yeah,
brilliant.
It's an astonishing sort of builds on all the prophecy that we've heard so far and takes it to another level altogether. Some of the stories are incredible, and some of the likenesses to Jesus, I think, are also very striking.
Yes,
after what it all
true.
means. Well, there's a lot to dig into there. Let's have a chat about that next week.
Yeah, and in this Advent period running up to Christmas, we hope that you get to see some of what the Gospel writers saw in Daniel and quoted about in regards to what Jesus would look like on his arrival. So yeah, do enjoy listening to that, and we'll look forward to chatting with you about it next week. Thanks for listening.
Bye.